Hello, everyone. This is the Nature of Order series, Chapter 3. We've got a rainy day to hear some ambient raindrop noise, maybe, and certainly some good diffused light. So previously on the Nature of Order, we had been going over the importance of understanding how seeing the world as degrees of life and of areas of things that are not biological containing, and understanding it as a certain kind of life, how that is very useful in creating a design that is more vibrant, that is more alive, that is more wonderful to be in. And now, how does that actually work? What is this? We've understood that there is this way of feeling things that are more lively. Is there a way of understanding how that is structured so that we can consciously and deliberately have something that works well in that way? So that's what the theory of wholeness and centers are. Beginning here, in order to understand life as a phenomenon, this revised view of life, it's necessary to define something which I call the wholeness and certain crucial entities which I call centers, the building blocks of wholeness. He admits that they're rather abstract. They are. But, so here we go. Further on, a view of the building as a whole means we see it as part of an extended and undivided continuum. It is not an isolated fragment in itself, but part of the world which includes the gardens, walls, trees, streets beyond its boundaries, and other buildings beyond those. Perhaps one of the best ways to quickly define a center is thinking about an object influencing and influenced by its context. So I think that all good design takes this into account. A lot of people who do very good design intuitively, or of their own skill, they're going to be doing this. I'm pretty sure all of you who are designers have done this. What this is a conceptual tool. It's a framework of looking at things and making decisions that helps you take your innate design feeling and make that clearer, make it faster to come at the decisions that people feel are successful and good, and to discover, and this is the thing that I found most useful, to discover things that you wouldn't necessarily otherwise. Very specifically in the terms of centers, there was a project that had a really acute angle in a backyard, and I applied this to it, and we ended up coming up with a shape of the outside of the house as it related to the backyard and the interior of the house, in a fairly straightforward manner that we were happy with, that the client loved, that I don't think necessarily I would have come up with had we not been using this kind of approach. And it's very good for collaboration, which this process was. So, to understand, he starts off with a very, very charmingly simple case of wholeness. And you can always understand wholeness as the physical geometric properties. We're talking about the shapes of things, positive and negative space, 2D, 3D, the shapes of things and how that works and what that means. Start out with a sheet of paper, and you have, is this going to work today with that light? There it goes. The difference between a sheet of paper with a dot and with not a dot on it. And even adding one dot to it changes. And you can see that there are certain areas, certain things become implicit but very, very real. If you just visualize, what does that dot imply about the rest of the space on the shape? They're not shown. He calls them latent centers, but they're very much there. And here, there you can see at the top of the page, is exactly what he's talking about. There's kind of a circular area around it. It divides things into left and right. It divides things into up and down. And then when you superimpose them, there are also lines coming out. You superimpose them and you get this kind of overlapped thing like that. And if you were, for example, designing, say for example, that this was a plot of land upon which you were going to put a tree or put a house, and then you were going to have paths around it, you were going to have fences. You would want to build all those. You wouldn't necessarily imitate these shapes of the diagramming, not necessarily, maybe you would sometimes, but all of those areas and geometric elements which the position of the single dot implies are all factors that influence how you shape the other things, the other centers which you add. So this is a very important way of seeing things. So he talks about the entities which come into existence in a configuration are not merely cognitive. This is important. We're not just making this up. That diagramming, those aren't just things that you visualize in your head. That's actually part of the geometric situation of the paper when the dot's on it. They're not merely cognitive. They have a real mathematical existence. They're actually occurring features of the space itself. They may be established mathematically according to the relative hierarchies of differentiation in the space. They are mathematically and physically real. They have different degrees of strength. So on the concept of a center, it's very important, saying that the fact that each one of these entities has as its defining mark the fact that it appears to exist as a local center within a larger whole. And this goes both ways. So each center is made up of smaller centers, and it itself is has a context within it, and it itself is part of a broader context. And we talk about different ways of seeing the world. Well, this is a somewhat distinct way of seeing the world. Christopher Alexander didn't invent this. He did not invent this. He's, in fact, the footnotes, the endnotes to this chapter are fascinating, because he goes across and he acknowledges all the bunches of stuff that he did not invent. And one thing that I was very glad to have a conversation with him about was of Leibniz, because he only mentions Leibniz once directly, but it's kind of implicit through all of this. And he kind of stopped and thought about it, and he just kind of smiled and said, yes, I think Leibniz is a very good place to start. He thought that, because I noticed in my own research that Leibniz was describing very clearly and acutely this type of shift in worldview, specifically with the monadology. You could understand, and lots of people define monads in different ways. There's the kind of ridiculous Gilles Deleuze monad where it doesn't have any windows and it's a Baroque house and upstairs, and he's consciously screwing around. Read the introduction to that book, by the way. But there's the Giordano Bruno's monad, which has to do with spiritual unity. The whole idea of a monad is a unity instead of a dyad. Two things. It's a monad. It's a single thing. It's a unity. So Leibniz's idea of a monad is an atom of conceptual form. So if you have a cube is a kind of monad because you can't really divide it or reduce it without having it no longer be a cube. You can split it up into atoms, but then those are atoms. Those are not cubes. So everything that exists as a coherent thing is in itself kind of a monad. And each monad is made up of smaller monads. Each monad is part of larger monads. And it's a very interesting way of seeing the world. And he mentions this. He actually uses a very, very almost spookily similar example talking about ponds. Leibniz, when he was discussing with the Countess, I forget her name, but one of the nobility that he philosophically tutored or talked with, Countess Conway. That's who it was. I believe it was Countess Conway, or maybe she did the translation of Newton. It doesn't matter. You guys can look at this ephemera. But he was I believe it was Princess Sophia, who was one of the daughters of King James or Charles. Anyways, I'm getting too distracted by that, but they were in the Garden of Herrenhausen, which had very many different little pools, and in each pool was kind of a smaller thing with fish, and then he was kind of inspired by this, or she was inspired by this. And in the discussion that the both of them had, they realized, well, wait a minute, you can always find a smaller world within any world. You can always find a larger world outside of any world. And kind of one of the proofs that this has been filtering up and bubbling up into modern consciousness, some of you may have thought about it already, because that's like the end of Men in Black. Yeah, it's worked its way into, we've become more aware of this now. Our technology helps because we can have microscopes where we actually see how that stuff works. It's always been there, but with our technology, we can see it more directly with our telescopes and with our microscopes. The ending of Men in Black is like that you see that the universe is actually, there's a tiny little universe in the cat's necklace, and then there's a big universe that we're part of the thing inside the cat's necklace. And so that's kind of a playful way of describing really kind of the way that the universe works, that there are infinite things going in small and infinite things going up big. So it's a good way to look at how things are like that. He says there's no natural way to draw a boundary around a pond, which gets just the right things and leaves out just the right things. You don't have, in this kind of recursive worlds within worlds and worlds outside of worlds, there's no super sharp boundaries between them. There are these kind of liminal spaces, boundary spaces, where the objects fade into each other. And that's important to look at, important to realize, especially for design. If you think about the yard of a house, I mean, sure, there's there are boundary lines, there are property lines, but if you're going towards the doorway of a house, that has one kind of feeling. If you're at the sidewalk of a house, that has a different kind of feeling. And then, like, where in the yard do you place things, and do you set things up so that the sidewalk feeling or the door feeling is more important? And that impacts stuff. It impacts where you place things, how big things are. And I think this is very interesting. On one occasion, I was discussing the concept of centers. It applied to some bedroom curtains. I love how he brings this down to a very regular, concrete example. I was discussing bedroom curtains with my wife, Pamela. She made the comment that the use of the word centers, as I had been explaining it to her, was already changing her view of looking at everything around her, even as we were talking. She said, when I look at the curtain in the room, I think not just of the curtain, which you would in the kind of the mechanistic thinking, you would think these are assembled entities. It is the curtain. We are deciding the curtain. Hold on. If we're thinking about how that works, she said, when I look at the curtain in the room, I think of the curtain rod, the window, the sky, the light on the ceiling as centers. I become so much more cognizant of the relatedness of all things. It is as though my awareness increases, my eyes suddenly perceive everything in such a different way. I think that's accurate, that you're not choosing just the curtain in of itself. You're not going to the fabric store and just looking. Maybe you do go get the sample, but you're not just thinking, I am choosing just on the sample. If you do that, you get disappointed, because then you think, oh wait, there's the color of the room, there's the light, there's the curtain rod, there's the space of how it is on the wall. All of these relational elements are extremely important, and we can get to this later, this is one reason why being in person makes so much of a difference. You can design on the computer, and if you design only on the computer, you're going to screw stuff up in a way that you wouldn't screw stuff up, or you're going to waste time in a way that you wouldn't waste time if you also used judiciously the on-site visits and the on-site mock-ups, because you're going to be seeing all of this stuff and all these centers and all this contexts in a more accurate, direct, and pragmatic way. Very, very important. And oh yeah, here's another good example. So if we have two dots, you can see how it changes things again. You get that diagram. And as we get more sophisticated, there's the idea of fully drawn out geometry, of kind of the pitched triangular top of the outline of maybe a door or something, and how that shapes it, and then a triangular top on a door, how that creates a very different situation for the whole facade. Not just for the door itself. Changing the door changes the whole. Changing a part, as we all know, changing a part changes the whole. This is rather beautiful. And how that these are not, and everything that he talks about in this book, and the 15 fundamental properties, which we'll get to eventually, which are kind of the hallmarks of understanding how creating this life can work. They're not elements that you combine and make something with, like a recipe. It doesn't work exactly that way. That these are epiphenomena. These are things that happen like whirlpools around the side of something. And here, he gives an interesting example: a whirlpool in ocean water. The center of the whirlpool is not an element. It's not something that's assembled. Like Alan Watts said, the difference between an organism and a mechanism is assembled where an organism grows. The whirlpool in ocean water, the center is not an element. It forms within the wholeness. Each part is kind of speaking to and talking to the other part. And due to their own mutual influences upon each other, that's how the whole emerges. So all of these things like emergent this and organic that, they sound very fancy and highfalutin, but it's very important to understand them in this very, very simple way, because that's really how you have to do it in order to make, I think, how you have to do it to make good decisions. So I always try to bring the complex down. This was really fascinating. There's footnote, for anyone playing along with the book, this is page 92, endnote 15. I'll read the text first. His endnotes and appendices are fascinating because there's all this stuff that he cites. Learning to see the wholeness in a case like this is not muddled or contaminated by words and concepts is extremely difficult. So he gives an example of a man laying next to a tree with a bicycle in a road and looking at this and just perceiving the geometry without outside concepts of tree, bicycle coming in. We're just seeing it as form itself. It's challenging. Kind of a fun challenge. It's extremely difficult, but it's possible to learn consciously to pay attention to the wholeness. The difficulty is discussed at some length in Appendix 3, which is an interesting psychological experiment, where I also give one example of a technique for helping a person see the wholeness as it is. Okay, so that's what he was talking about, and then he endnotes this endnote. Here we come back to Chuang-Tsu. And Chuang-Tsu? I looked this up. Chuang-Tzu is the alternate, more pinyin, Wade Giles pinyin. These Westerners can't make up their minds about how they want to transliterate and spell Chinese names. But he's referring to, you always notice different things in books. He's referring to an old Taoist philosopher. This is the guy, everyone thinks it's Confucius. I thought it was Confucius who talked about the butterfly and am I a butterfly or am I a man? With that whole dream of the butterfly. A man dreaming I'm a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming I'm a man. It's Chuang-Tzu who wrote that. He had this very playful kind of philosophical text, very interesting. I have no idea what the heck Christopher Alexander is talking about here. He's all over the place. He's talking about understanding the wholeness, fine, in his experiments, and he's like, here we come back again to Chuang-Tsu. Where? So I have this, I'm going to have to look this up. I do have a PDF of this thing somewhere that I can search, but he mentioned Chuang-Tsu before. If anybody out there in YouTube land knows and can tell me, comment below. What the heck was he talking about with Chuang-Tsu? But, and the difficult task of seeing the world as it really is by seeing the entities in their proper order of saliency and not a distorted one. This is important. He talks about the hierarchy of centers. There are some things that are more important than others. For example, the position of the door. Here's a very obvious one. The position of the door and the shape and size of the door is more important to pay attention to than the doorknob. That's an obvious one. There are less obvious ones all over the place. For example, the shape of the yard versus the shape of the path that goes through it. Each one defines the other, but how are you, right? If there's something in the yard that's working like this, the shape of the roof versus the shape of the rafters, the shape of the bathroom versus the shape and size of the bathroom versus the shape and size of the living room, location of windows as you see them outside versus windows as you see them inside. So it sounds abstract, but this hierarchy of the wholeness and salience of centers, you need to pay attention to this, because there are things called confounding variables, where making one thing better makes another thing worse in a design. Position of a window is a perfect example of that. It's not easy. It's not easy to tune that and get that perfect. It's kind of one of the most fun things to do because it is challenging. The same point has also been, so the proper order of saliency and not a distorted order of saliency is important. The same point has been made forcefully by David Bohm, the physicist, Fragmentation and Wholeness, and published in the Van Leer Jerusalem Foundation, 1976. This is, yeah, he goes real deep on this stuff. I'm not sure what he meant, but I could find out someday. Goes about examples, talks about the home. This is a wonderful... I had the good fortune to visit there. That's his. That's where he spent very many of his years in Sussex, where he and Maggie were. The two-slit experiment. This is fascinating. The two-slit experiment, and this is why he often said that this innovation in architecture he thinks could quite possibly bring about an innovation in physics. That the reach towards a grand unified theory could come from this theory of centers and of wholeness. We don't have the time. I'm already at 20 minutes here. We don't have the time to get into the two-slit experiment here, but the two-slit experiment, which has to do with the particle-wave duality, he sees the idea of centers and wholeness as being able to describe coherently what otherwise seems like a contradiction in the two-slit experiment, because this new way of seeing the world helps that. One of the most puzzling experiments of the 20th century is the two-slit experiment. Electrons pass through a pair of slits, land on a wall. The experiment counts the electrons by arriving at different positions. What has been shown conclusively is that the pattern of electrons arriving on the wall cannot be explained by the normal classical picture of mechanical forces acting on the electron. Physics has concluded that in some way the electron is guided by the wholeness of the experimental configuration. Mathematics is well understood, but the physical interpretation is not understood even to this day. Although analysis and interpretation of the way wholeness should be understood has not yet been agreed upon, there are strong reasons for thinking that the wholeness which causes the motion of the electron is essentially the same wholeness we have already defined. What is most remarkable is that it appears that this wholeness influences the movement of electrons in a way that exists over and above any mechanical effects. The wholeness has a fundamental part to play in governing the behavior of matter. So, and this was doubtless part of the personal discussions that he had with the physicist David Bohm. Both of them, him on the macroscopic architectural scale, David Bohm on the microscopic and quantum levels, were thinking of what we call field theory. All of this is involved in field theory, the interaction of object upon field and field upon object. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle is a good example of the field effect. That maybe not, but the position and location of an electron are obviously interrelated, but you change your perspective and you can see one thing but not the other. But both things are there. You're changing. The field is different to you depending on your point of view. I think how the uncertainty principle is understood. So, and all that stuff is beyond what I'm an expert in. I'm only vaguely familiar with that physics. But the big shift away from what you could call classical mechanics or Newtonian mechanics is that thinking of the world as a watch, thinking of the world as billiard balls, as discrete elements that interact and bounce off one another. Instead, thinking of the world as a field with effects and forces, and mutually interwoven effects and forces, producing complex behavior. It's a different way of looking at things. And he talks about all kinds of very interesting ways of seeing wholeness, elements, and centers. This is rather beautiful. So these two, you can see with these pictures. So there's a family in India. Chris worked in India, I believe, sometime in either the 50s or the 60s. I doubt that he took that picture, but and so here's a classroom where you have the building. His idea is that people are often social interactions themselves are centers and are very important centers. That's a really great picture of light streaming through the Hagia Sophia, that you have something like the world, the astronomy is part of a center. And when ancient architecture was very good at doing that and conceiving of the building or the structure as a center interacting with the other centers way up there in the sky. And that's a beautiful and amazing thing to do, as we see right there with the angles of light and the placement of the windows and the Hagia Sophia, done absolutely deliberately in that genius bit of work done by some Armenian stonemasons working for the Greek Romans and Constantinople. These are important. So he highlights how the moment of a young, it looks like maybe a young Italian man greeting a bishop. I don't think that's the Pope, but greeting a bishop and kissing his ring and saying hello, and that moment of religious blessing happening. That itself is a center, and centers are time-based. They could last for a few minutes, like the two boys hanging out and talking up there, or for very briefly for an instant. And even though that lasted an instant, in that young man's life, that's probably a very big moment to meet the bishop, and he probably said some prayer for someone that he was very concerned about, and the bishop blesses him, and they have this moment which lasts for just an instant, and then it goes away. But even though it's a very fleeting center, it's a very important center. Another good example of that, of a time-based thing, is that you have these interacting centers that a woman who is expecting is there, and so this is another idea of how life, in a very biological sense, how life grows like this, that she in herself is a center, and the child that is growing there, that child is also a center. And then there's that switch to where the child is growing within, and then when the child is born, the child's growing, and we're all familiar to some extent. We've all been through it. We're all familiar with how that works, and how that's it's kind of miraculous how this stuff works. It's pretty great. So life comes directly from the wholeness. The idea that there is a good friend and colleague of mine, Thomas, I should give credit to these good ideas that he has. He was talking about the sense of play, not in the sense of just fun, but in play in the sense of interaction, positive interaction as play, as movement, as dialogue is very important in how he wants to understand many different things. And life coming from the wholeness, I think, can be understood in that way, as it's a play of the centers, in and amongst themselves. And the end of this chapter says, the essence of wholeness is as I have defined it. It is neutral. It simply exists. At each place in the world, with its natural habitat, there's in any instance a given wholeness. Some is definite or well-defined system of centers that creates the organization at that part of the world. And the wholeness always exists in some form, whether the place is good, bad, lifeless, or alive. But we shall see next that the degree of life that comes from the wholeness, and only from the wholeness, the neutral wholeness spawns characteristics which are far from neutral. Right, so this is an underlying universal principle of the way that geometrical things exist and interact with each other. Great. But then the quality of this will be in what we're designing. Is it the quality you want, or the quality that you don't want. How does that work? How does it impact your feeling? How do you pay attention to your own feelings so that you can see how that's working? This neutral wholeness, which lies under the surface of every place, is the natural origin of life. Life comes from it. Life comes from the particular details of the ways the centers in the wholeness cohere to form a unity, the ways they interact and interlock and influence each other. The academic and difficult task of grasping the nature of this wholeness will pay us back by giving us the origin of life. This is very, very, very dramatic. There are long footnotes at the end here. For years, I struggled with the idea that everything in all form was made of entities. I first struggled with it in a lost manuscript, The Universe of Forms. So he wrote something and then lost it. Wow. He wrote it between 65 and 67. It caught fire. Without any... God, that's horrible. I'd formulated a theory in which I tried to show how all order and form could be understood by building things up from coherent wholes which appear in space. Years later, I came back in 70 to 75. I came back to these ideas and struggled with them again in the timeless way of building and a pattern language. So this is something, this isn't a change for him. It's been going on. He's been examining this his whole career. But yeah, I think this is fascinating stuff. Hopefully, you guys also think it's fascinating. I think that Christopher Alexander, and he even admits this himself, he's just barely on the edge of this stuff. It's a little bit like Galileo, understanding the elements of inertia. Understanding acceleration, criticizing the strict Aristotelian mechanics by saying, wait a minute, do we really want to think that things on Earth move in a straight line and things in the heavens move in a circle? No, it makes more sense to look at it this other way. And that was it was a very important breakthrough that Galileo made, but Galileo was also, Newton came later, and because standing on the shoulders of giants, because Newton came later, he was able to say, wait a minute, I agree with this Galileo, I disagree with this Galileo, thank you for these breakthroughs, let's figure something else out. And then it didn't stop with Newton either. And I think that there's this kind of Galilean, pre-Newtonian feeling about what I see in this, and so it really is part of my intention here, not to follow in the footsteps of the wise, but to seek what they sought. I don't see this as me continuing exactly what Chris did. I want to kind of figure out what is this stuff that he was discovering, because I think there are ways to understand this, that it can be done clearer, that it can be done better, and so forth, because that's what happens with science. That's how I feel about it. I hope, thank you for listening. If you've gotten this far, please like, share, and subscribe. Comment below. Would love to hear your thoughts. So, next time on The Nature of Order, how life comes from the wholeness. Talking about even more specific examples in architecture about how form and objects and centers that interact with each other create this specific sense of liveliness. Pictures of the Amalfi Coast, Oriental rugs, all kinds of nice things. See you tomorrow. Have a good day.